The documents Thomas Kane found in the railroad company's safe would start a war. Hidden beneath routine survey reports and construction schedules was a folder marked Apache Solution Phase 2, containing detailed plans to massacre an entire village of peaceful Apache families. The Pacific and Western Railroad Company wasn't just planning to build tracks through Apache territory. They were planning to eliminate every Apache man, woman, and child who stood in their way, then blame the Indian uprising on Apache aggression to justify military intervention and federal land seizures. Thomas had been hired as a surveyor to map the best routes through the mountains, but what he had discovered was a conspiracy that reached from boardrooms in San Francisco to the highest levels of the territorial government. Standing alone in the company office at midnight, with the evidence of genocide in his hands, Thomas faced the hardest choice of his life: expose the truth and become a wanted man, hunted by both corporate killers and corrupt officials, or stay silent while 500 innocent Apache families were slaughtered for railroad profits. But to understand why Thomas Kane would risk everything to stop a conspiracy that could make him rich beyond his wildest dreams, you need to know about the promise he made to his dying father 10 years earlier, and why a man who had spent his entire career building railroads would choose to destroy one rather than let it be built on innocent blood. Because this story begins not with corporate greed, but with a surveyor's decision to honor the values his father taught him, even when honoring those values meant losing everything he had worked for. It was March 15, 1876, when Thomas Kane first rode into the San Pedro Mountains of Arizona Territory, carrying transit equipment, survey chains, and a commission from the Pacific and Western Railroad Company to map the most efficient route for their proposed transcontinental extension. At 34 years old, Thomas was one of the most respected railroad surveyors in the West, known for his meticulous accuracy and his ability to find routes through terrain that other engineers considered impassable. The job seemed straightforward enough: survey 3 potential routes through Apache territory, calculate the costs and engineering challenges of each option, and recommend the path that would be cheapest and fastest to build. The railroad was offering Thomas more money than he had ever made on a single project, enough to buy his own surveying company and establish himself as an independent contractor rather than a hired employee. What made the offer even more attractive was the railroad's assurance that they had already negotiated agreements with the Apache tribes whose land the tracks would cross. Company officials had shown Thomas documents bearing official territorial seals, stating that Chief Cochise and other Apache leaders had consented to railroad construction in exchange for annual payments and guaranteed safe passage for Apache families. Thomas had worked on railroad projects before that required negotiating with Native American tribes, and he knew how complicated such agreements could be. The fact that the Pacific and Western had apparently resolved all political issues in advance suggested that this would be a purely technical project, focused on engineering rather than diplomacy. That suited Thomas perfectly. He was much better with surveying instruments than with political negotiations. The first sign that something was wrong came during Thomas's third week in the field. He was establishing a baseline measurement near Coyote Creek when he encountered a group of Apache hunters who seemed surprised and concerned to see a white man with surveying equipment in their territory. Through hand gestures and the few words of Apache he had picked up over the years, Thomas tried to explain that he was working on a railroad project that their chiefs had approved. The hunters' reaction was immediate and alarming. They spoke rapidly among themselves in Apache, their voices rising with what sounded like anger and confusion. One of them, an older man with streaks of gray in his hair, approached Thomas directly and spoke in broken English. "No railroad, Chief, never say yes railroad, you lie." Thomas was taken aback. He pulled out a copy of the territorial agreement that the railroad company had given him, pointing to the official seals and signatures. The older Apache examined the document carefully, then shook his head vigorously. "This not Chief Cochise mark. This not our words. Someone lie to you, white man." That conversation haunted Thomas for the rest of the day. Either the Apache hunters were mistaken about their own tribal agreements, or the railroad company had shown him forged documents. Both possibilities were troubling, but Thomas tried to convince himself that there must be some reasonable explanation. Perhaps the hunters weren't authorized to speak for their chief, or perhaps they hadn't been informed about negotiations that had taken place at higher levels. But Thomas's doubts grew stronger over the following weeks as he continued his survey work. He encountered several more Apache groups, and their reaction was always the same: surprise, concern, and insistence that no railroad agreement had been made. Some were angry, demanding that he leave their territory immediately. Others seemed more puzzled than hostile, asking why he thought he had permission to be there. Thomas found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His job was to complete the survey and recommend the best route for the railroad, but he was beginning to suspect that the entire project might be based on fraudulent documentation. If the Apache had never actually consented to railroad construction, then his presence in their territory was not only unauthorized but potentially dangerous for everyone involved. The situation became critical when Thomas encountered Chief Cochise himself during his 6th week in the mountains. The meeting was unexpected. Thomas was measuring elevation changes near a mountain pass when he looked up to find himself surrounded by Apache warriors, their leader an imposing figure whose weathered face and steady gaze commanded immediate respect. Chief Cochise studied Thomas for a long moment before speaking in clear English, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are the man who measures the land for Iron Road. My people have told me of you." Thomas nodded carefully, aware that his next words could determine whether he left this encounter alive. "Yes, sir. I'm working for the Pacific and Western Railroad Company. I was told your people had agreed to allow construction through this area." Chief Cochise's expression darkened. "No agreement, no permission. Railroadmen never speak to Apache. They speak only to territorial officials who have no right to give away Apache land." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I was shown documents. Official territorial papers with signatures and seals. Show me these papers." Thomas retrieved the documents from his saddlebags, handing them to Chief Cochise with trembling hands. The Apache leader examined them carefully, his face growing grimmer with each page. "These signatures are false. These seals mean nothing to Apache. White man's government cannot give permission for Apache land without speaking to Apache people." Chief Cochise handed the documents back to Thomas, his voice heavy with the weight of years of broken promises and betrayed trust. "Many times white men make papers that say Apache agree to things Apache never heard of. Then white men use papers to take land, kill people, build what they want. You are part of this lie, whether you know it or not." Thomas felt the full impact of what Chief Cochise was telling him. The railroad company hadn't just misled him about having Apache consent. They had knowingly sent him into Apache territory with forged documents, using him as an unwitting tool in whatever larger scheme they were planning. "Chief Cochise," Thomas said slowly, "I didn't know the documents were false. If I had known, I never would have come here. What should I do?" The Apache leader studied Thomas's face for a long moment, apparently trying to determine whether his surprise and concern were genuine. "You stop measuring land. You go back to railroad men. You tell them Apache will fight any railroad that comes through our territory without our permission. You tell them false papers will not protect them when Apache warriors defend our homes." Thomas nodded. "I'll tell them, but I don't think they'll listen to me. I'm just a surveyor. Then Apache will tell them in a way they understand better." There was no mistaking the threat in Chief Cochise's words. If the railroad tried to proceed with construction based on forged documents, the Apache would respond with violence. The result would be a war that would cost lives on both sides and ultimately give the government exactly the excuse it needed to justify massive military intervention in Apache territory. As Thomas rode back toward the railroad company's field headquarters, he found himself confronting an impossible situation. If he reported that the Apache had never consented to railroad construction, the company would either abandon the project or find another way to proceed. If he said nothing and allowed construction to begin, the resulting conflict would likely lead to the deaths of hundreds of people, both Apache and white. But Thomas's dilemma became even more complicated when he reached the company's temporary office near Tucson and discovered that his supervisor, railroad construction manager William Harrison, had been expecting him. "Kane!" Harrison called out as Thomas dismounted from his horse. "Perfect timing. We need to discuss some changes to the project timeline." Thomas followed Harrison into the office, a large tent equipped with drafting tables, filing cabinets, and a safe where important documents were kept. Harrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had built his career on completing railroad projects on schedule and under budget, regardless of the obstacles involved. "The company board is getting impatient," Harrison explained, pouring himself a whiskey from a bottle he kept on his desk. "They want construction to begin within 6 months, which means we need your survey recommendations within the next 3 weeks. Can you make that deadline?" Thomas hesitated. "Mr. Harrison, I need to discuss something with you about the Apache agreements. I've encountered several Apache groups during my survey work, and they all claim that their chiefs never consented to railroad construction." Harrison's expression didn't change, but Thomas noticed a subtle tension in his shoulders. "Is that so? Well, I'm sure there's just some misunderstanding. Different tribes, different chiefs, communication problems. You know how it is with Indians." "I spoke with Chief Cochise himself," Thomas continued. "He examined the territorial documents we were given, and he says the signatures are forged. He says no Apache leader ever agreed to this railroad." Now Harrison's expression did change, becoming carefully neutral in a way that told Thomas more than any emotional reaction would have. "That's a very serious accusation, Kane. Are you sure you understood what he was telling you? Language barriers can cause all sorts of confusion." "He spoke perfect English, sir. There was no misunderstanding. He said the Apache will fight any railroad construction in their territory." Harrison set down his whiskey glass and walked to the tent flap, looking outside as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Kane, let me explain something to you about how railroad construction works in frontier territory. The legal situation is always complicated. Territorial governments, federal agencies, tribal authorities. Everyone has different ideas about who has the right to authorize what. Sometimes paperwork gets filed in the wrong offices. Sometimes signatures get backdated to match earlier agreements. Sometimes documents get created to reflect understandings that were reached verbally, but never properly documented." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Harrison wasn't denying that the Apache documents were forged. He was explaining why forgery might be necessary. "Are you telling me the company knowingly used false documents?" "I'm telling you that the company has legal authorization to build this railroad, and that authorization doesn't depend on getting permission from every Apache brave who thinks he owns the mountains. The territorial government has the authority to approve railroad construction, and they've given us that approval." "But Chief Cochise says—" "Chief Cochise," Harrison interrupted, "is going to say whatever he thinks will preserve Apache control over land that legally belongs to the United States government. His opinion about our documentation is irrelevant." Thomas stared at Harrison, realizing that his supervisor had just confirmed his worst fears. The railroad company hadn't just used questionable paperwork. They had deliberately ignored Apache rights and were planning to proceed with construction regardless of tribal opposition. "What happens when the Apache try to stop construction?" Thomas asked. Harrison's smile was cold and calculating. "That's not really your concern, Kane. Your job is to survey routes, not to predict political complications. Just focus on the engineering challenges and let the company handle everything else." But Thomas couldn't let it go. "If the Apache attack construction crews, people will die, both Apache and our workers." "That's a risk in any frontier construction project," Harrison replied. "The company has contingency plans for dealing with hostile Indians." The way Harrison said contingency plans made Thomas's blood run cold. He was beginning to understand that the railroad's plans for dealing with Apache opposition might be far more sinister than simple defensive measures. That night, Thomas lay awake in his bedroll, staring at the stars and trying to decide what to do. He could complete his survey and collect his payment, walking away from a situation that wasn't technically his responsibility. The railroad company had hired him to map routes, not to resolve political disputes with Native American tribes. But Thomas kept thinking about Chief Cochise's words, about the Apache families, who would be caught in the middle if this project proceeded as planned. He thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he accomplished, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for his principles. Thomas's father had been a railroad engineer who had died in a construction accident when Thomas was 24. His last words to his son had been simple: build things that make the world better, not things that make you richer. For 10 years Thomas had tried to honor that advice, working on railroad projects that connected isolated communities, brought supplies to frontier settlements, and helped build the infrastructure that would allow the West to develop and prosper. But this project felt different. This wasn't about building something beneficial, it was about taking something that didn't belong to the company and using forged documents to justify the theft. Thomas made his decision the next morning. He would complete his survey work as promised, but he would also document everything he had learned about the forged Apache agreements and the company's plans to ignore tribal opposition. If the railroad proceeded with construction, at least there would be a record of the truth. But Thomas's plan to simply document the conspiracy fell apart 3 days later when he accidentally discovered the true scope of the railroad's contingency plans. He had returned to the company office to pick up additional surveying equipment when he noticed that Harrison had left the safe open. Through the gap in the door, Thomas could see folders and documents that weren't part of the normal construction paperwork. Curiosity overcoming caution, Thomas glanced inside and saw a folder labeled Apache Solution Phase 2. Thomas looked around to make sure he was alone, then opened the folder and began reading. What he found inside made his hands shake with rage and horror. The documents laid out a detailed plan to eliminate Apache resistance to railroad construction by provoking a military conflict that would justify the complete removal of Apache families from the territory. The plan called for disguising railroad employees as Apache warriors and staging attacks on white settlements, creating the appearance of an Apache uprising that would require massive federal military intervention. Phase 1 had already been completed, establishing a presence in Apache territory under the pretense of legitimate surveying work. Phase 2 would begin once Thomas completed his route recommendations. Railroad employees dressed as Apache would attack isolated ranches and mining camps, killing white civilians and leaving evidence that would implicate Chief Cochise's band. Phase 3 would be the military response. Federal troops would be deployed to pacify the hostile Apache, driving them from their traditional lands and opening the entire territory to railroad development. The plan estimated that the pacification would result in approximately 500 Apache deaths, but characterized this as an acceptable cost for securing railroad access to valuable mineral deposits in the mountains. Thomas read the documents 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just corporate greed or frontier politics. This was a plan for genocide, carefully orchestrated to appear like a justified military action against hostile Indians. The railroad company was planning to murder entire Apache families to clear the way for their tracks. The final document in the folder was even more chilling, a list of territorial and federal officials who had been paid to support the plan, including judges, military officers, and members of the territorial legislature. The conspiracy reached far beyond the railroad company, involving dozens of powerful men who stood to profit from Apache land seizures. Thomas closed the folder and backed away from the safe, his mind racing. He now possessed evidence of a planned genocide, but he was completely alone in a remote territory, surrounded by people who were part of the conspiracy. If Harrison discovered that Thomas had seen these documents, his life wouldn't be worth a plugged nickel. But Thomas also realized that he might be the only person in a position to stop the massacre. If he could get word to honest federal authorities or to newspaper reporters in the East, the exposure might be enough to derail the plan. The challenge would be getting that evidence to people who weren't part of the conspiracy without being killed in the process. Thomas quickly gathered his surveying equipment and rode out of camp, telling Harrison that he needed to check some measurements near the southern route. Once he was safely away from the company office, he began planning his next move. The nearest federal marshal was 3 days' ride away in Prescott, but Thomas had no way of knowing whether Marshal Davis was one of the officials on the railroad's payroll. The territorial governor's office was even further away, and Thomas had seen Governor Stevens' name on several of the payment documents. Thomas's best option might be to ride north to Colorado and send telegraph messages to newspaper editors in Denver and San Francisco, hoping that public exposure would force federal authorities to investigate the conspiracy. But that would mean abandoning his survey work and breaking his contract with the railroad, making himself a fugitive in the process. As Thomas considered his options, he realized that time was running out faster than he had initially thought. According to the documents he had seen, Phase 2 of the Apache Solution was scheduled to begin in just 10 days, immediately after Thomas submitted his route recommendations. If he was going to stop the massacre, he would have to act quickly. But Thomas's dilemma became even more urgent that evening, when he made camp near a creek and was approached by a young Apache woman who emerged from the darkness like a ghost. "You are the surveyor," she said, in English, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Ayanna. I bring message from Chief Cochise." Thomas rose slowly from his position beside the campfire, keeping his hands visible and trying not to make any sudden movements. "I remember you," he said. "You were with the chief when I met him last week." Ayanna nodded. "Chief Cochise sends warning. Apache scouts have seen white men with painted faces near settlement. They dress like Apache but move like white men. Chief thinks this is trick to make trouble for Apache people." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The railroad's plan was already in motion. The fake Apache attacks were about to begin, and once they did, the momentum toward war would become unstoppable. "Ayanna," Thomas said urgently, "you need to tell Chief Cochise that those men are not Apache. They're working for the railroad company. They're planning to attack white settlements and blame your people for the raids. Why would railroad men do this? To start a war. If there's a war, the army will drive the Apache away from their land, and the railroad can build tracks wherever they want." Ayanna studied Thomas's face in the firelight, trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. "You have proof of this?" Thomas thought about the documents in Harrison's safe, evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy if it reached the right people. "Yes, I have proof. But it's back at the railroad camp, and I can't get to it without being caught. Chief Cochise says you are different from other white men. He says you speak truth even when truth is dangerous. Will you help Apache people stop this war?" Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing in her face the same determination and courage that he had observed in Chief Cochise. These people were facing extinction, and they were asking him to risk everything to help them survive. "Yes," Thomas said, "I'll help. But we need to be smart about it. If we make the wrong move, a lot of people are going to die." What followed was the most dangerous week of Thomas Kane's life. Working with Ayanna as his contact with the Apache, he developed a plan to expose the railroad's conspiracy while preventing the fake attacks that would trigger a war. The plan required Thomas to return to the railroad camp and act as if nothing had changed, completing his survey work while secretly gathering evidence of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Ayanna would alert Apache scouts to watch for the fake raids and capture any railroad employees they found disguised as Apache warriors. Thomas managed to photograph several of the incriminating documents using a small camera he normally used for documenting geological features. The process was nerve-wracking, requiring him to wait for opportunities when Harrison was away from the office and the safe was open. On the 5th day of their plan, everything went wrong. Harrison returned to camp unexpectedly and found Thomas near the safe with his camera. The confrontation was brief and violent, ending with Harrison pulling a gun and demanding an explanation. "You've seen the Apache files," Harrison said, his voice deadly calm. "I can tell by the look on your face. How much do you know?" Thomas realized that lying would be pointless. Harrison could see the guilt and knowledge in his expression. "I know about Phase 2, Thomas said. "I know about the fake raids and the plan to blame the Apache." Harrison nodded slowly. Then you know too much to walk away from this. I'm sorry, Kane. I genuinely liked you. But the company has too much invested in this project to let one surveyor's conscience derail everything. Harrison raised his gun, but before he could fire, an Apache arrow struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. Ayanna emerged from behind a supply wagon, bow in hand, with 3 Apache warriors at her side. "The fake Apache you sent to attack settlers," Ayanna said to Harrison as he clutched his wounded shoulder. "We captured them. They told us everything when they thought they were going to die." Harrison's face went pale. "You can't prove anything. My word against a bunch of Indians." Thomas held up his camera. "Actually, I have photographs of all your documents. Phase 2, the payment lists, the whole conspiracy, and now I have witnesses who can testify about what you just tried to do to me." The exposure of the railroad conspiracy became one of the biggest scandals in territorial history. Thomas's photographs and the captured railroad employees provided federal authorities with undeniable evidence of the planned genocide. Harrison and 17 other conspirators were arrested and tried for conspiracy to commit murder. Chief Cochise became a key witness in the federal investigation, his testimony helping to convict not just railroad officials, but several territorial politicians who had been part of the conspiracy. The Pacific and Western Railroad Company went bankrupt from the legal settlements and the loss of their territorial construction contracts. Thomas Kane never worked for another railroad company. Instead, he established himself as an independent surveyor, specializing in projects that required negotiating fair agreements with Native American tribes. His reputation for honesty and cultural sensitivity made him one of the most sought-after contractors in the Southwest. Ayanna became Thomas's business partner, and eventually his wife, helping him navigate the complex relationships between white settlers and Native American communities. Together, they established surveying practices that became models for respectful cross-cultural cooperation in frontier development. The Apache Solution conspiracy trial established important legal precedents for federal protection of Native American rights and corporate accountability for crimes committed against indigenous peoples. The case was cited for decades as an example of how individual courage and cross-cultural cooperation could triumph over institutional corruption and racial hatred. But perhaps the most important legacy of Thomas Kane's decision to expose the conspiracy was the precedent it set for white Americans who found themselves in positions to either support or resist injustice against Native Americans. His example proved that individuals could make a difference, that corporate power wasn't insurmountable, and that doing the right thing was possible, even when it required enormous personal sacrifice. Years later, when Thomas was asked why he had risked everything to stop a plan that would have made him wealthy, his answer was simple: "My father taught me that a man's character isn't measured by what he accomplishes, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for his principles." I could have gotten rich by staying quiet, but I couldn't have lived with myself. The railroad tracks were eventually built through Apache territory, but only after fair negotiations that provided the tribe with significant compensation and guaranteed protection of their sacred sites. The route that was finally chosen was actually longer and more expensive than what the Pacific and Western had originally planned, but it was built with Apache consent and Apache workers, creating a model for how development could proceed without destroying the communities it affected. Chief Cochise lived to see his people's rights respected by federal law and their culture preserved for future generations. In his final years, he often spoke about the white surveyor who had chosen justice over profit, proving that honor and courage could bridge any racial divide. Thomas Kane died in 1923, at the age of 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried both Apache and European heritage. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from both cultures, a testament to the bridges he had built through one crucial decision to choose conscience over convenience. The story of the Apache Solution conspiracy serves as a reminder that individual choices can have enormous consequences, that corruption and greed can be defeated by courage and principle, and that the most important battles are often fought not on dramatic battlefields, but in quiet moments when ordinary people decide whether to do what's right or what's profitable. In an era when corporate power seems overwhelming and individual action seems meaningless, the example of Thomas Kane offers hope that one person willing to risk everything for justice can still change the world.